Glad you're here, though, this morning as we continue through this series. And again, as Tom just read, you might have noticed there's a theme that we're going to be looking at today that happens in the book of Proverbs. There's a theme that kind of rides through this whole narrative. And it's something that maybe you understand, maybe you don't. For me, it's something that is like a constant journey to understanding what this word means. If you're looking at it in your Bible, again, as Tom just read, Proverbs chapter 10. You'll see that there's kind of this thing that happens here. So again, maybe you'll look for it. If this was Sesame Street, I would say, look for the word. Like there's a word of the day. Look for this word of the day. See if you can find it in these passages, okay? So the first thing you see here is in chapter 10, verses 2 and 3. And we're kind of going to hop around after this. But in 2 and 3, it says this: ill-gotten treasures have no lasting value, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Down in verse 6, blessings crown the head of the righteous, but violence overwhelms the mouth of the wicked. The name of the righteous is used in blessings, but the name of the wicked will rot, which is a really intense line, right? The name of the wicked will rot. The righteous, we're going to have these blessings, okay? Then you go on to what we just saw in chapter 10, verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. You see kind of these two parallel pieces. Maybe you can catch what we're talking about today. But there's kind of these two parallel pieces happening. There's one that is the mouth or the goodness of somebody, the righteous. The righteous has a name behind him. The righteous has something that is a legacy that they are leaving. The righteous seem to be this one side, and then the other side is the wicked. But I want to focus today because really in the book of Proverbs, this idea of righteousness shows up time and time and time again. We see this idea of righteousness. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, the word righteous or righteousness is used 66 different times, which is quite a bit. That's a lot of times. That shows up in every single chapter. We see this idea of righteousness being an issue that Solomon wants us to deal with. What is righteousness? How does it work? That's the question that I think we have to deal with. Maybe you're familiar with righteousness. Maybe this word is something that you're fully understanding, right? Maybe you're like, I totally get what righteousness is. I know it from the old hymns, right? Like it's in, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, right? Maybe you're like, I get it. I've heard this before. Maybe you're a really big fan of the Unchained Melody, and you're a big fan of the Righteous Brothers. I don't know your life. Maybe that's what you're all about. Maybe you're a really big, maybe you're a surfer. Maybe you're really into Crush from Nemo, and he loves to say righteous, right? Like righteous. Like maybe that's what you're used to, right? Maybe that's where you think of it. And that's fine. That's fine. We probably all have different versions of this, and that's kind of the problem of what righteousness is. It's kind of this slippery term we don't all fully understand. Just a few days ago, Oliver and I were in the car. We were driving through over near 19 in Holiday area. And as we were driving through, Oliver was like, is this the spot where that house was? And I had totally forgotten about this. He says, is this where that trespassing house was? It's like, what do you mean the trespassing house? He was like, remember the house with the trespassing? It's like, oh, right. Now, I remember when he was younger, we lived over in Holiday, and in our neighborhood, there was this house that it wasn't like a house anybody could live in. It was very small. It looked like a pump house, like something like maybe an outhouse that had gotten a little bit larger kind of thing. But it was this little house. It had windows and it had doors, but all around it, it said no trespassing, and it said this is government property. Now, I don't know what government property is there. I don't know what's happening in this house. I assume it's where the CIA guy who's on the other side of my Alexa, that's where he's at. Like he lives in that house and he answers my questions. That's my assumption Mr. Siri is in the house or whatever. But it's like a weird situation. Like there was this weird house and it was in the middle of a neighborhood. There was lots of houses around it, but all of a sudden everywhere around that house, there were signs that just said, no trespassing. Do not trespass government property all over the place. And I was like, man, this is really weird. And again, it couldn't have been a place where anybody lived. It was a weird spot. I remember we were walking by one day. And Oliver, when he was younger, we were walking by, and Oliver was like, he's like, hey, Dad, can we walk up to the trespassing house? I was like, well, no, it very clearly says that we cannot walk up to the trespassing house. In fact, it says everywhere. That's why it's called the trespassing house to you, is because it says do not trespass. And he was like, I really want to see it. And I was like, I'm going to be honest, too. I want to know what aliens they have stored in there as well. I think we're all interested in what this Area 51 in the middle of Holiday is. I would love to know. And he was like, I really want to walk up to it. I was like, yeah, we can't. And so we're walking by, And we walked to the sidewalk, and I'll never forget it. There was a spot, like right where the sidewalk ends, and the grass begins going into this. And you could just see Oliver as he was like up against the line. He's like, Dad, I really want to trespass. I was like, Oliver, we all want to trespass. But we don't get to trespass. He's like, but I really want to trespass right now. Now, it was like amazing to watch this inner turmoil within him, trying to figure it out. And he goes, Dad, if I step over this line, if I step onto the grass, is that trespassing? I was like, I think so. I think that's where it starts. He's like, but then, like, how do they know if I trespassed, if I step onto the grass? I was like, that's a great question. I don't think anybody knows. I just don't want to take the chance because I don't know what's in there, and I don't think we should really be messing with this right now. He's like, I really want to take a step. Now, he was asking questions. He was trying to justify it. If I took a step in, would that be trespassing? He later asked me if we were to send a drone over it, would that be trespassing? He was really interested in this situation. He later asked me a few other questions about if we stepped into it, what if we were allowed to go to the door? What if we found somebody else? What if we went to one of the neighborhoods next to it, one of the neighbors next to it? We walked into that neighbor's yard, right? And we got really close to it. Would that be trespassing? Now, this is the problem with righteousness, is we're all trying to justify and figure out what's right and what's wrong, right? This is the problem we have with this term, is that it's really slippery, if we're being honest. Because we all kind of have our own justifications and own versions of what righteousness is and how it works. We don't have kind of just one general overarching idea of it. We kind of all think that we can, either we have what we think it is, or we think we find ways to skirt this all the time. I mean, how many of you know, and maybe I'm the only one, how many of you know somebody who has done a certain act that we would call a sin, and when they've done it, it's been fine because it was them doing it. But as soon as somebody else did that same sin, they're like, oh, they're the worst. Like they have, right? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Anybody have those people in your life? Where you know, like, and maybe you're the person, if we're being honest, I think we all are. It's fine when I did the thing, but when they did it, oh, they really stepped over the line there. They really trespassed. Not me. I wouldn't do that. I mean, I did too, but I want to do it the way they did it, and therefore I'm better. This is why righteousness is a really slippery term for us. It's really hard to come by and understand what this is. Now, I want to kind of take, like, I'm just going to be honest. We're going to take a little bit of a dive into understanding this because it shows up so many times in the book of Proverbs. I think we have to address it. And we're going to do a little bit of, I'm sorry, it's going to be a little bit of a language lesson, but I promise the goal is not language. We're not trying to change your language. We're in understanding language better. We're actually trying to change the way we live. And this is hopefully not a language lesson, it's a living lesson. This isn't just a practical thing, it's a spiritual thing. And I hope that we kind of get to that place. So just follow me as we kind of go through this. Because Solomon actually, as he begins the book, he tells us a little bit more about what righteousness is. He kind of unpacks it a little bit. And there's this phrase that he uses, not just him, but it's something that shows up in the entire Bible over and over again. So if you have your Bible, if you have that in front of you, flip back just a couple pages and go to Proverbs chapter 1. I want you to see, he begins the whole thing here. It says this, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction. And then for understanding words of insight. So we're gaining wisdom, we're getting instruction, we're understanding the words, for receiving instruction and prudent behavior. And here's what it's all for. Here's why all this is being written. It's for doing what is right and just and fair. His goal is that we would learn these things so we would know right and just. Now, these two words, if you're not familiar with this, is what's called, it's a hymdatus. In the English understanding, it's a hymdatus. Hymdatus is something where there's two words that go back, they go together. Do you know what I'm talking about, like a hymdatus? It's like this thing where you put two words together. So if I was to say, like law and, you might say order, right? Does that make sense? So if I say law and, you would probably put another word with it, order, right? So if I was to say like in college campus, if I was to say room and board, right? You kind of have this other idea that goes with it, right? If I was to talk about furniture, I'd say crate and barrel probably, or whatever, right? If I was to talk about great music, I would say hall and oats. Yeah, obviously. That was a deep cut, and you didn't expect. I was thinking, what would be the most relevant thing I could say today that would like connect with everybody? And I was like, Hall and Oates. You know, that's where everybody's living these days. We all love Hall and Oates. Simon and Garfunkel, right? So you have like these things that go together, and one actually magnifies the other. They speak to each other, but they speak kind of in conglomeration, conjunction with one another. So the two terms actually magnify the other term. What happens in the Bible, and actually, I promise you, this will be something that if you look for it, you will see this over and over. It will be like that car that you're buying, like when you see that car that you're buying, and all of a sudden you start to see that car everywhere on the road, where all of a sudden your eye is tuned in for that. If you look for these two words together in the Bible, you'll see it over and over again. They're always used in conjunction with each other. There's right and just. Righteousness and justice. These two words go together over and over throughout the Bible. So there's this idea of righteousness, right? And with the idea of righteousness, we see that it is its own piece of this puzzle. But then there's a second part that comes into it, this mispet, which is this idea of justice. Justice is an outflow, but also a conglomeration with the idea of righteousness. The two cannot be separated. They seem to build upon each other. It's very important for us to understand this. In fact, this isn't the only place this even shows up just in the book of Proverbs, right? In Proverbs chapter 2, Solomon kind of reiterates this again. In chapter 2, verse 9, he says, then you will understand what is right and just, right? So he's saying it again. Then you'll understand what is right and just and fair. Every good path. Like this is what you're going to do. The way that you're going to learn, the way of Jesus, the way of living, the right path comes through doing what is right and just. We can't separate those two things from each other. In fact, towards the end of the book, in chapter 21, he says it again. Let me see here. I think I didn't mark it, but in chapter 21, he says it again, where he says, it's on the screen. That's great news. So it says, to do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Like it shows up over and over again, just these two words being in conjunction with each other. Now, the right and just has to be something we understand. Like it has to be something that we get. What is righteousness? What is justice? How do they play together? In the biblical narrative, like in the entire biblical epic that we see of the Bible, righteousness and justice go hand in hand, and they play a part in every single phase of the biblical narrative. If you're not familiar with like kind of the biblical epic, like if you were to look at the Bible as an epic and 5 kind of easy steps of understanding the Bible, there's this first part where there's relationship. So the first part of the Bible is relationship. And what we see is in that very beginning is that God is with man when he begins all of the world. God is not separate from man. He is in relationship with man. And what he's doing is actually saying, now you are in relationship with each other. He's saying you are in relationship with the world around you, right? He tells them to fill the earth, to rule it and subdue it. Everything is in its order and in its place. He's saying this is your relationship with other man, other people, but also your relationship with the animals and the plants and the world around you. He's setting up a relationship, and he is not distant from that relationship. God is completely present. That's the most amazing part about the garden, is it doesn't say that God left the garden and went to heaven and then came back to talk to Adam and Eve when he wanted to. It says that he was completely present in the garden at all times. There was no separation, and so they were living in complete relationship with one another. This is the first form of what we see of righteousness. They were in right relationship at all times. There was a righteousness happening. But then we see this second act, which is rebellion. And if you pay attention, what does this mean? What is rebellion here? Rebellion is when mankind decided to say to God, actually we'll decide right and wrong for ourselves. Remember, this snake shows up, and which is weird, and the snake starts talking to Eve, which is even weirder, and then the snake, which seems very articulate for a snake, starts to say things about how you can decide. You will know what is right and wrong. You will know what is good and evil if you eat of this tree. You'll get to decide for yourselves what righteousness looks like. Now it's up to you. And everybody gets to choose for themselves what righteousness looks like. And that's the act of rebellion that sends us down the path really for the rest of the biblical narrative, where we start to see now there's retribution. We live in a world where there is a fallenness because we decide what's good and bad. We decide what's right and wrong. We decide what righteousness looks like and what justice is. And this is where the second part has to start to come in, is now there's restitution. So there's retribution, which starts to be this thing where there's problems on the earth, but then there's restitution where suddenly things are starting to be paid back. Jesus comes to redeem all things. And when he shows up to redeem all things, what happens is there's this act of justice. Not just righteousness, but justice. They're setting things back in place, making things right again. It changes the way that we view the world because now there's justice that is being set in place. Not just righteousness, but justice. And at the end of all things, kind of the era that we live in today is this era of restoration where it's like there's still brokenness, but there's also this future kingdom of heaven that is happening right now in our midst. It's both in the future and it's in the present. And it's this future present of the kingdom of heaven that's happening in our midst, of things being restored over and over again right in our midst. And we're going to live in that all the way until the end of whatever this age looks like and whatever Jesus has in store for us. That's what it looks like, as we're fully trying to figure out restoration. But that's an act of two things, not just one. It's an act of righteousness where the righteousness of those relationships have been restored and justice is taking place. There has to be both righteousness and justice in our midst at all times. In fact, when you look at what happens here in this biblical narrative, you might still be like, I don't really like get it all. But I do understand that there's been a brokenness and there's now this restoration of things. We live in this act of restoration, still restoring relationships and justice to the world around us. That's why I think it'd be a really cool church name, is that you're doing this thing where you're trying to restore the relationship between God and man and restore justice to the earth that needs it. But the two have to go hand in hand. And here's kind of my fear. I'm just gonna be honest, because right now you're probably already I know where this is heading. What we're heading down is the road, and if you're not familiar with it, you're probably you may not know this, but some of us, you're I know where we're heading, okay? So there's a righteousness, and what you're going to tell us is that we cannot be righteous. I'm not righteous, you're not righteous. You're going to quote something like, there is no one righteous, no, not one. You're going to tell me how I need Jesus to be right. There is no way I can ever be right. There's only one person who is the mediator between God and man, and he's going to make us all right. But I can't do it on my own. I'll never get there. I only can do this through Jesus and through his help to make me right with God again. That's how righteousness works. You might be thinking, that's where we're heading. That's where this is going. Now, you're probably right about that, actually. That's actually a pretty good guess, because that's true. I'm not going to lie to you. That is true. Righteousness does exist on the shoulders of Jesus. That is where right relationship was restored. But it's not the end of the justice part. See, there's two parts to this conversation. There's righteousness that has been restored, that we are in a right relationship with God. But there's also a justice part where we're trying to figure out how do we become people who bring justice to this world. I do agree that we're going to be people who are always going to struggle. We're always going to be people who cannot find righteousness on our own. That's not natural in our nature. I just don't think there's too much brokenness in this world. D.A. Carson says it this way, and if you know this quote, it's a brilliant quote. D.A. Carson says, people do not drift toward holiness. If you were just naturally living your life, you would not drift toward holiness. Apart from grace-driven effort. Now notice it's grace-driven. I think that's important. People do not gravitate toward godliness, prayer, obedience to Scripture, faith, and delight in the Lord. No, we drift toward compromise, and we call it tolerance. We drift toward disobedience, and we call it freedom. We drift toward superstition, and we call it faith. We cherish the indiscipline of lost self-control, and we call it relaxation. We slouch toward prayerlessness and delude ourselves into thinking we have escaped legalism. We slide toward godlessness and convince ourselves that we have been liberated. It's a brilliant idea, right? It's hurtful. It hurts a little bit, but that's our natural inclination. Is we're going to be people who don't naturally tend towards holiness. We need righteousness to come from an outside source. That's where we're at. And I would say, actually, it's not that I think we can't be righteous on our own. I think that's a difficult thing. I don't think it's that you don't know what right and wrong is. I don't think it's that I don't know what right and wrong is. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis spends a lot of time talking about how there's kind of a human code of ethic. Right? He makes the case, and this is just a simple case, but he makes the case in Mere Christianity that we all know that if you were on a subway, if you were in the tube, I think as he calls it, if you were on the tube and you were to, if I was a young man and I was to just take the seat of an elderly woman who was having trouble standing, we'd all be you're kind of a jerk. Right? I don't think Anybody in the room not think that? Because everybody's going to hate your guts. Like, you should know that, right? Like, this is a person who needs a seat. I'm taking the seat of somebody who needs it more than me. Human nature does have something within us. I do agree with that. And so I don't think it's that we don't know what right is. I think that our needle, this is just me speaking, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think our needle for right and wrong, like if we were to say what's the true north of right towards righteousness, it's not that we're like 100% just wrong. It's just that our needle is just a few degrees off. Just enough that it's a problem. And that needle being just a few degrees off, I'll tell you which direction it's going, by the way. It's just a few degrees off towards me, towards selfishness. I want to do what's right, but I also want to do what's right by me. Like, you know what I'm saying? I think that's generally where we skew. Even look at the garden story. It's that Adam and Eve want theirs. They want to know what's right and wrong, but they want to know what's right and wrong so that they can be equals with God. There's an inherent selfishness that comes with it. And immediately after they make this fall that we now know as the fall in Genesis 3, immediately after that, we see them start to blame each other, right? We see Adam say that famous line, "This woman you gave me this apple," which is a great line and something that'll definitely save your marriage someday. This woman you gave me, right? Like, it's your fault. You gave me her, God. It's your problem, not mine. And we see a blame game. He's blaming God in some ways. He's blaming her in some ways. God, if you wouldn't have given me this woman, I wouldn't have these problems. Which, I mean, no woman, no cry. I see where he's going with it. But then there's also the other side where, he blames then her as a human. We start to see this blame game because everybody's got to get what's theirs out of this. I need what's best for me. I don't think that we're totally right and wrong, like adjacent or like ignorant. I don't think that's where we're at. I think we're right and wrong adjacent. We're just like, we're close to right and wrong, but it's just going to be skewed toward me all the time. It's going to be a little bit of like, yes, this is good for everybody else, but mostly it's good for me. Does anybody else feel that? Maybe I'm the only one that thinks that. And that's why we need like righteousness from outside of ourselves. We need righteousness that comes in and takes away the selfishness and actually takes on the burden of right and wrong in a way that we can't. We need an atonement for that because we are not going to be good at this. I don't know if you've noticed this or not. Just look around. I don't know this city, the state, the country. How good are we at just discerning right and wrong? How good are we really at discerning what true right and wrong is without giving little filters of what we think is right and wrong inside of it? We're not great at figuring out righteousness as a true like white and black issue. We're really good at finding all the gray. And the gray part always has something about it what's best for me in it. This is where I think it's best. And so there's righteousness that, yes, we need that. We need something to come along because we're going to skew ourselves towards this. But then there's an outflow of that because the first part is we have to be righteous. And in righteousness, here's what happens. It's a right relationship that's been restored with God. It's not just right action. It's right being. Like being in the right relationship with God. Everything's been set back to Genesis 1. Everything's been set back to where we are now in full relationship with God. And imagine what that's like. Like, that's a tough thing to take in. We're in full relationship with God again. And what that means, and I want to put this out there because I think this is important as we think about what this first part looks like with righteousness, is that means if you're in that kind of relationship with God, that you are actually loved by and a child of God. That's going to matter. Trust me. It's going to matter in just a second. You have to understand that you are loved by and you are a child of God. That's part of what righteousness is you've been put in a right relationship with God. I know a lot of people who carry a burden of guilt. They walk on a tightrope of like just shame that they're about to fall into at all moments because they think at some level and I think we all maybe feel this way at some level, that God doesn't really love us. Like God tolerates us. He puts up with us because he's supposed to. But I don't know that we really believe, like many of us do, that God actually just loves us. And I don't know that we believe that God will love us the same now as he would have 10 years ago, or that he would in 10 years from now. I don't know that we believe God loved us the same when we were still yet sinners as he loves us when we're doing things right. I don't think we think that God loves us as much on the days where we say a few bad words and we cut people off in traffic, or when we are people who drive well and we recycle and stuff. Like, I don't think we think he loves us the same on all those times. To understand righteousness means that we have to understand that we are now, because of Jesus, not because of what we've done, we are in right relationship with God, which is a big burden to bear. God isn't mad at you. God isn't angry with you. God actually loves you. That's what righteousness is. If we don't have that right, I'm just going to tell you the next part's not going to work. The next part is that there's this second area, not right, but the second word that we see every time is justice. Justice is an outflow of righteousness. It comes part and parcel with. The two go hand in hand. Justice is something that we've been called to be for a long, long time. All the way back in Genesis, Genesis 18, when you look at the first time that God really has ordained this relationship between him and Abraham. So in Genesis 12, God shows up to Abraham. He starts to make promises. He says, Abram, you're going to be the father of many. And Abraham's like, cool, I can't wait to have lots of kids. And then God's like, but not like now. Like, you're just going to wait a while. Like, we won't have kids like immediately. Just give it a second. I don't know, you're only 100. We got plenty of time to start having babies. And so Abraham's like, I don't think this is going to happen. He's starting to get nervous. And these three travelers come along. It's a very weird story. Three travelers come along, and they actually affirm the promise that God has given Abram. They're like, you are going to have lots of kids. You are going to be the father of many. You're going to have lots of nations under you. And actually, if you remember, this is the story where they say this to Abraham and Sarah goes into another tent, and she laughs. You remember this? She laughs at God because she's like, that's ridiculous. She's like, I know my boy, he's pretty old. I'm not doing so good anymore either. You know, I got these hips don't do what they used to do. I mean, they may not lie anymore. They still don't lie, but like they're not doing what they used to. I don't think it's going to work. I think this is over. And she laughs at God. And immediately after that, it says this, that the men reaffirm what God had said. And they say, Abraham will surely become, this is them speaking to Abraham, a great and powerful nation. And all nations on earth will be blessed through him. Right? And then it says, for I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way, there it is again, this way of living, the way of Jesus, the way of the Lord, by doing what is, how do we do the way of the Lord? By doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Both things have to happen. They are right and just. The two go hand in hand. First, they have to be in right relationship, then they will do what is just after that. The just becomes the next part. Tim Keller, in his book, Understanding kind of the Israelites and what Abraham becomes. Remember, Abraham's people become Israel. And Israel eventually becomes what we would know today as the church. He says this, biblical righteousness is inevitably social. This is what righteousness looks like to him. It's social because it is about relationships. When most modern people see the word righteousness in the Bible, they tend to think of it in terms of private morality, like sexual chastity or diligence in prayer and Bible study. That's what we think of righteousness as. But in the Bible, Zeka, which is that word that we just saw for righteousness, refers to day living, and in which a person conducts all relationships in family and society with fairness, with generosity and equity. Righteousness cannot exist without being a social construct. It is a social thing. We have to have the justice that goes out from there, and we actually do this. This is why it's right and just. This is why the two matter and they go hand in hand, is that there's a right relationship, but it has to have an outflow into the community, into the world around us. This is where justice comes in. Now, I think the problem I've seen, and maybe I'm the only one, is we all have stories. We all know of these stories, where if you were to ask yourself, are we living in that model? God sets up with Abraham, you're going to have a land and a people called Israel. They're going to be right and they're going to be just. That Israel then becomes the church. We are now Israel. We are now those who are supposed to be right and just. And if you were to ask yourself, as maybe the Big C church, are we living right and just? Are we living in righteousness and justice? Are we doing that? Like, and the individuals within that church, are we living in righteousness, right relationship with God, and then justice for the people around us, the social part, the relationship with the people around us, the good that comes out of that relationship we have with God? Is that happening? And here's why I think these two things matter. Here's why I think they matter to have them in the right order and to have both connected to each other. Maybe you can relate to this. Let's say we do the second part. We do justice, but we forget about righteousness. Like, we want to do the social part where it's I can do good acts in the world. Right? I'll do the good for the people around me, but I don't yet know and I don't fully understand the intrinsic love that God has for me. What does that do to us? In my opinion, what it makes us do is we start to do good works because we want people to see us and we want people to like us. And we start to become codependent because we need other people to want us and to see us as valuable because we've forgotten that we have an inherent value in God, that God has given us. So we start to do these acts because we're like, you need to need me. You need to like me. You need to want me. And this trickles into every relationship we have. You guys, I can't be the only one who sees people in dating relationships and marital relationships that you're like, oh, you should not be in that. And you're giving everything you have. Why? Because I need you to want me so bad. I need you to like me so bad. Why? Because I don't understand the intrinsic value I have by being a child of God. We all know people who do really good works. They do really good stuff, and they can't wait for everybody to see them and notice them and like them. But the thing at the core of them that they've missed is that they don't need that because they've forgotten that they are intrinsically loved and valued by God. I'll tell you, as a person who has struggled with this for most of my life, where I want people to see me and notice me and like me and think I'm cool, the problem is not that is necessarily its own issue. The justice part is not the problem. The problem is that I've forgotten the righteousness that I have within me. That I'm a child of God who is loved and valued. And this is where a lot of people, honestly, a lot of churches, a lot of pastors I see, this is where things fall apart. Is we start to be seen as a certain kind of person. We want everybody to notice us. We want to do the justice part of doing good works in the world. And we even want to help save people, but what we've forgotten is that we ourselves are saved by someone. And so we do all this work thinking that we can save ourselves by doing such good stuff. And it wears us out and it exhausts us. I know pastors who have burned out this way, not because they weren't doing good work, but because they thought they were the only ones doing good work, because they had forgotten that God had loved them and valued them. And so they thought, I just need to keep up. I need to be the hamster on the wheel, keep doing good work for people. If we're being honest in this room, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's seen this happen or is having it happen. Where on a daily basis, we're trying to do all the good we can but we've forgotten about the righteousness. We're just worried about the justice. On the other hand, there's some of us that do the opposite problem. Some of us, we do the first part without thinking of the second, where we only want the righteousness that we get with God. And it's like, well, that's good enough, right? Instead of becoming codependent, we just become independent. Because we're like, I'm here. It's good enough for me. God likes me. He doesn't really like you a whole lot. And it moves from righteousness of between me and God to self-righteousness between me and me. Like, I got this. I'm good at this. I figured it out. And so we start to become independent and start to become self-righteous because we are good with God and nobody else needs to be part of that. We don't need to do anything for anyone. And in fact, we don't need to have anyone else that is saved by or saved from or saved to, because we are saved, and that's enough. And actually what it usually does for us, we look down on others. We look down on those around us. We think that they could not be part of what we're part of because we're better than, we got here first, we're good. And that's the downside of just having the righteousness without the justice. What God tells Abraham is you're going to be both. You're going to be right and you're going to be just. You're going to have the right standing with God, and you're going to share that with the world. You're going to be people who do justice in the world outside of that. Yes, you're a child of God, but you were not just made for him. You were made for the world around you as well, to bring good into the world. In fact, 2 Peter does a really good job. And I stumbled in this verse the other day. I was reading through 1 Peter, and actually, just so you know, in a few weeks we're starting a series on 1 Peter, and so I know this is a huge cliffhanger because you're like, I can't wait to get into that, and so I'm sorry to keep you waiting, but it's going to be great. I was actually thinking we're going to go through 1 Peter in a few weeks because I think 1 Peter does the best job of helping us understand how to live as exiles and those that live outside of the kind of confines of the community around us and the world around us, the culture around us, living just as Christians in a world that's really polarized and divided. And I don't know if you know this or not, but there's this thing happening like November that I think is going to make us really polarized and divided. And I think we need to learn how to live as Christians within that, separate from, but still a part of. And so we're going to go through 1 Peter in a little while. But I was reading through 1 Peter, and I kind of stumbled into 2 Peter, and I found this passage that just hit me as I was thinking about this. Because what it seems to be is that there is this movement and this progression that we are supposed to be on. When we are in right relationship with God, that's great, but it's not just supposed to stay there. Notice what Peter writes. He says in chapter 1, verse 3, His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Do you see this? Like, his power has made us right with him. His power has done this for us. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. You might notice this, but here, that was the righteousness part. Now we're going to move into the justice part. He says, for this reason, because you've been made right, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to your goodness knowledge, and to your knowledge self-control, to your self-control perseverance, to your perseverance godliness, and to your godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. But whoever does not have them is nearsighted and blind, forgetting that they have been cleansed from their past sins. Forgetting that they were made righteous. And why were they made righteous? They were made righteous so that they could do justice, so they could be people who change. Now, if you read through that list, I'll just ask you how we're doing it being people who bring that into the world. Not just being made right with God, but the next steps, he says things like goodness. Are you a person that is known for goodness? Are you a person that's known for self-control? Are you a person that's known as a person that is godly? Are you known as a person of love? Those are all things that he says are supposed to be an outflow of the righteousness that you have. Those bring the justice part to the world around you. So when we read passages like in Proverbs, chapter 11, for instance, it lays out this idea that like righteousness is at the top of all things. It says in chapter 11, verse 10, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy. The righteous prosper and a city rejoices. Why does that city rejoice? Because you're not just a person who does right relationship with God, but you're a person who inherently would bring justice into the city around you. There, one theologian, his name's Gerhard von Rad, which is such a cool name. His last name is literally von Rad. And if you asked me to either be an evil villain or a theologian, my name would be Gerhard von Rad. And so it says this. He says this about this passage. He says, Israel, again, now the church, encountered the good in quite a different way. The good was experienced by her quite simply as a force, as something which determined life, something they experienced daily as effective. That is, as something present, about which there needs to be little discussion as dark and light. So basically what he's saying is, do you have to discuss if it's light outside or dark outside? No. Like good in this justice idea just exists. You can see it. You'll know it when you see it. You don't have to think, is that light? Is that dark? No, we know what it is. And he says, the good man is one who knows about the constructive quality of the good and the destructive quality of evil, and who submits this pattern which can be discerned in the world. He is the righteous man, the diligent, the temperate, the one who is ready to help, the one for whom this goodness of his itself turns out to be good. The good is that which does good. Goodness was, therefore, always something public, never merely internal. It was always a social phenomenon. When it goes well with the righteous, right here in this verse, a city rejoices. By the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted. The behavior and activity of the individual are always viewed both with regard to their consequences and with regard to the effect of the society. Saying this has to be a noticeable thing. So your righteousness may be what you are. It's a state of being. But your justice is what you are doing. So righteousness is being, but justice is doing. And you cannot separate the two things. I read one other theologian. I just want to give you a quick quote from Bruce Walkie. And I'll be honest with you, this one kind of hit me pretty hard as he dissected this. But he said this: righteousness is a pattern of life. So again, it's not just a one-off thing, not just doing a couple good acts. It's a way of life. Not merely specific acts. What is at stake is personhood, not merely performance. Like who you are is righteousness. The performance may be justice, but who you are is the personhood. Disposition rather than just deeds. Character behind and beyond the conduct. This kind of life and behavior has a religious dimension as well as an ethical one, since the righteous depend on the Lord. Now this is the part that got me, these next pieces. Righteousness refers to the moral quality that establishes right order, and justice refers to the moral quality that restores that order when disturbed. The righteous, this last line here, the wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. But he says, but the righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves in order to advantage the community. He makes that parallel that both happen. And I wonder about this for us, because again, I think that our needle is usually skewed towards selfishness. If righteousness and justice are those that are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community, and evil are those who are willing to disadvantage the community to only advantage themselves, like where do we fall in that? As Israel or the church now, do we really disadvantage ourselves to affect the community? Do we do that? Or is that like just something that gets in the way of our free time? Is that something that's just an inconvenience for us? And if it disadvantages me in any small way, I'm not going to advantage the community. I will rather disadvantage the community just to advantage myself. If that's what righteousness and justice look like. If I'm being honest, when I read that quote, I thought I might be more evil than good here. Because at many times, my selfishness, my view of what's right by me, I would rather disadvantage everyone else so that I just get a little bit more of what I want. So that I can advantage myself ahead of everybody else. I don't know where you fall in that, like how you feel about that, if that's noticeable to you. If that's something you're dealing with, or maybe it's just me. What does that look like for you? Would you say you are a person who is both right and just? Are you living out the biblical mandate of being both right and just? Are you advantaging your community even when it disadvantages you? Are you living in such a way that you are right and just both? I want to just close by reading actually a song in Isaiah chapter 5. Isaiah 5 has this thing called the Song of the Vineyard. And the Song of the Vineyard is at the beginning of Isaiah. It lasts about a chapter. And he writes this song as a social commentary, like saying, this is where we're at. Showing where Israel is. This is where Israel has gone. And trying to look at Israel through this lens of like, are we where we were supposed to be? Abraham was supposed to be a person who brought into the world this world of righteousness and justice. Are we that place? Are we living a right and just life? And he writes this as like a social commentary, which we don't have a lot of songs like that anymore. But I mean, like, it's kind of the Rage Against the Machine type of version of songs, like where he's writing about a social commentary of like where we're at. This would be the Bob Dylan songs, the times they are a change type of stuff. That's what he's writing here. He's writing something that's very poignant and saying this is where we're at as a culture. Or like maybe, by the way, I found out that there's an REM song that is a big cultural commentary called What's the Frequency, Kenneth? It's a great song. You should look it up, and it's about Dan Rather. So I'll let you figure that out. You can put that together later. But these are important things, like for us to understand, like this is a real commentary on what's happening in the culture at this moment. But this is what he says in chapter 5, verse 7. This is where he's at, looking at the state of the Israel and the church and the people around him. Again, this is Israel at the time. This would be the church today. This is what he says. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel. This is what the vineyard is. And the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but he saw bloodshed. And he looked for righteousness. There's our two words, justice and righteousness. But he heard cries of distress. Like for us, is that what the church would look like today if God was looking at us? If Isaiah was writing to us, not just Israel then, but to the church now, if he was looking for justice, would he say that we're people who are just? If he was looking for righteousness, would he say we're people who are right and living in the right way? Would he say that we're people who are right with God and in right relationship? And are we people who are living out of that, an outflow of the right relationship we have with God to create justice in the world around us? Would he say that's true of us? Or are we doing the second one without the first? Or are we just doing the first without the second? Are we just doing part of what we've been called to do, or are we doing the whole thing? So as we close, and as we think about this a little bit, I just want to give kind of a practice and a posture, just a couple things that maybe is just to lead you through this for just a second as we kind of think through this. First, just a posture as we think about this in a way. The posture is just, as we go into this, as we just kind of repent or just think about these things, I would ask you to think about if you're a person of righteousness and justice, and enter that with a posture of humility. Like, just be humble and ask God, am I a person, am I making the community, am I disadvantaging the community for my advantage, or am I advantaging the community for my disadvantage? Where am I at in this? Have a posture of humility. Secondly, would you just make a statement of just an apology? If you feel like that's something we've not done well at, it's something you've not done well at, would you apologize? And that's a statement of just apologizing to God, saying that I'm sorry for what I've not done with what you've given me. Not living into the calling you've given me. I'm not doing what you've asked me to do. The third thing is an action. It is the practice. And the practice is repentance. Now, repentance isn't just saying you're sorry. Repentance is where you actually change. Like you actually do something different. So what does that look like? What does it look like to actually change your ways, the actions that you have right now? What are the things that you feel guilty about that maybe the Holy Spirit is convicting you of? What are those things? And it could be a couple different things. It could be that you feel like I'm not living in the right relationship with God that I'm supposed to live in, or I'm not a person who's bringing justice to the world that I've been supposed to bring justice into. Which one is that? Would you spend a moment or two just praying about that as we close? So we're going to sing for just